On the morning of February 18th, 2001, at approximately 9:47 a.m., FBI counterintelligence analysts working in rotating shifts examined a series of photocopied envelopes spread across a long table in a basement conference room at the Washington field office. The room was windowless, lit by fluorescent fixtures that hummed faintly in the otherwise silent space. These analysts had spent years working counterintelligence cases, first against Soviet intelligence during the final years of the Cold War, then against Russian intelligence services after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991. The envelopes before them represented fragments of what would become one of the most damaging espionage cases in American history, though at that moment, the full scope of the betrayal was still being assembled piece by piece. The envelopes themselves appeared unremarkable. Standard white business envelopes, the kind available at any office supply store. No return addresses, typed labels affixed to the front, addressed to various post office boxes in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. But it was the postmarks that had drawn the analysts' attention, specifically their locations and dates, which, when mapped and analyzed, revealed patterns that suggested something far more significant than routine correspondence. The analysts had been assigned to the investigation that centered on the possibility that a high-level source within the U.S. intelligence community had been providing classified information to Soviet and later Russian intelligence services for more than 2 decades. The accumulated evidence, comprising signals intelligence intercepts, analysis of compromised operations, and tips from intelligence sources, pointed to someone with extensive access, someone who understood intelligence tradecraft, someone who had been operating undetected for years. The envelopes represented one component of the investigative puzzle. Postal inspectors, working in cooperation with the FBI, had been monitoring certain post office boxes identified as potential drop points for intelligence communications. The monitoring was not continuous. Legal and practical constraints prevented that, but periodic reviews of mail flow patterns had identified anomalies that warranted closer examination. Certain post office boxes received occasional pieces of mail that, while not obviously suspicious in content, arrived on schedules that suggested coordination rather than randomness. One envelope in particular held the analysts' attention that morning. It had been postmarked in Arlington, Virginia in early 1999. The address typed on the label corresponded to a post office box registered under a name that FBI researchers had determined to be fictitious, a cover identity with no corresponding real person. The envelope had been intercepted, carefully opened, photocopied, and then resealed and delivered to avoid alerting whoever might be monitoring that drop point. Inside had been a single sheet of paper containing what appeared to be typed instructions regarding a meeting location and time, along with a reference to compensation. The significance of the Arlington postmark was that it narrowed the geographic area where the sender had accessed the postal system. Unlike a letter mailed from a standard blue USPS collection box, which could come from anywhere within a carrier route's pickup area, this envelope showed evidence of having been mailed from a specific post office branch. Postal records indicated it had been processed through the Arlington, Maine post office facility on Wilson Boulevard. This detail, seemingly minor, became more significant when cross-referenced with other envelopes in the series, several of which had also been postmarked from Arlington or from nearby locations in Northern Virginia. Before we continue with how this postmark helped expose the most damaging spy in FBI history, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to like and subscribe. We uncover these documented cases every week, bringing you the truth behind some of history's most consequential betrayals. Now, let's examine how Robert Hanssen's 22 years of espionage began. Within hours of the photographs being developed, copies were circulated within the FBI's Counterintelligence Division. The standard procedure was to compare surveillance materials against existing files, both FBI records and records from other intelligence agencies. For weeks, the search produced nothing definitive. The patterns were suggestive, but not conclusive. On October 31st, 2000, nearly 20 months after that particular envelope had been mailed, a critical break came not from the envelopes themselves, but from an intelligence source who provided the FBI with materials directly from Russian intelligence files, including letters and recordings that would eventually be matched to a specific individual. Robert Philip Hanssen was 56 years old in February 2001. He had been employed by the FBI for 25 years. Having joined the Bureau in January 1976 after working briefly as an accountant with a Chicago firm and then as an investigator with the Chicago Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. By 2001, Hanssen held the position of Supervisory Special Agent assigned to the FBI's Office of Foreign Missions Counterintelligence Squad. His official responsibilities involved monitoring and investigating the activities of foreign diplomats in the United States, with particular focus on those suspected of intelligence activities. Hanssen lived with his wife, Bonnie, and their 6 children in Vienna, Virginia, a suburb located approximately 12 miles west of Washington, D.C. The family resided in a large house on Talisman Drive, in a neighborhood characterized by tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and the general affluence typical of Northern Virginia's professional class. The children, Jane, Susan, Jack, Mark, Lisa, and Greg, ranged in age from teenagers to young adults. Hanssen drove to work each day, a commute of approximately 30 to 40 minutes depending on traffic, to the FBI's Washington field office or to various meetings and assignments throughout the metropolitan area. His colleagues at the FBI described Hanssen as intelligent but socially awkward, technically proficient with computers and communications systems, religiously devout. He attended Catholic Mass regularly and was involved with Opus Dei, a conservative Catholic organization, and generally unremarkable in his professional demeanor. He was not particularly well-liked, nor was he actively disliked. He occupied a middle position in the Bureau's social hierarchy, competent enough to be trusted with sensitive assignments, but not charismatic or politically adept enough to rise to the highest leadership positions. What none of his colleagues knew, what even his wife would claim not to have fully understood, was that Robert Hanssen had been providing classified information to Soviet intelligence and later to Russian intelligence, beginning in 1979. Over a span that would ultimately cover 22 years, with one significant interruption, he would pass thousands of pages of documents, dozens of computer disks containing classified files, and detailed information about U.S. intelligence operations, sources, and methods. The damage he caused would be assessed by intelligence officials as catastrophic, compromising operations, exposing human sources, and providing America's adversaries with insights into the most sensitive aspects of U.S. intelligence capabilities. Hanssen had been born in 1944 in Chicago, Illinois, to a family of Danish and German descent. His father, Howard Hanssen, was a Chicago police officer who later advanced to the detective division. His mother, Vivian, worked as a homemaker. According to later psychological analyses and interviews with family members, Hanssen had a difficult relationship with his father, who was described as demanding, critical, and emotionally distant. Robert excelled academically, particularly in mathematics and sciences, and attended Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, where he studied chemistry and graduated in 1966. After college, Hanssen attended Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, earning an MBA in Accounting and Information Systems in 1971. He worked briefly as an accountant before joining the Chicago Police Department in 1972. During this period, in 1968, he married Bonnie Walk, a devout Catholic from a well-educated family. Her father was a professor, and several of her siblings would go on to professional careers. The marriage would produce 6 children over the following years. In 1976, Hanssen joined the FBI. His first assignment was to the Gary, Indiana field office, where he worked white-collar crime cases. In 1978, he was transferred to New York and assigned to a foreign counterintelligence squad focused on Soviet intelligence operations. It was during this period, with access to sensitive information about how the FBI tracked Soviet intelligence officers and protected U.S. sources, that Hanssen appears to have first conceived of the idea of selling secrets. In November 1979, Hanssen made his initial approach to Soviet intelligence. Unlike many espionage cases where foreign intelligence services recruit assets through careful cultivation and ideological persuasion, Hanssen initiated contact himself. He sent an anonymous letter to a GRU officer, Soviet military intelligence, offering to provide classified information in exchange for money. The approach was transactional and direct. He wanted money. The Soviets wanted information. The arrangement was simple. Declassified files indicate that Hanssen's first period of espionage lasted from 1979 to 1980. During this time, he provided the GRU with classified information about FBI operations and techniques. He received approximately $20,000 in cash for these initial betrayals. The relationship might have continued indefinitely, but in 1980, Bonnie Hanssen discovered evidence of her husband's activities. According to Bonnie's later testimony, she found a substantial amount of cash hidden in their home, money that could not be explained by Robert's FBI salary. When she confronted him, he initially attempted to deflect, but eventually confessed that he had been in contact with Soviet intelligence. Bonnie was devastated. A devout Catholic who took her faith seriously, she insisted that Robert confess his sins to a priest. Robert agreed. The priest to whom Hanssen confessed gave him advice that would prove tragically insufficient. He told Hanssen to stop his espionage activities immediately, to donate the money he had received to charity, but not to report himself to authorities. The reasoning appears to have been that confession and repentance should be sufficient, that destroying Hanssen's career and family through legal consequences would serve no redemptive purpose. Hanssen followed this advice. He stopped his contact with the GRU. He donated money to Mother Teresa's charitable organization, and for approximately 5 years, from 1980 to 1985, he appears to have ceased espionage activities entirely. During this period, Hanssen's career progressed. In 1981, he was transferred to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., where he worked in the Soviet Analytical Unit. In 1983, he was assigned to the FBI's Intelligence Division, where he had access to extremely sensitive information about U.S. intelligence operations against the Soviet Union. His security clearances gave him access to top-secret and sensitive compartmented information, the highest levels of classification. In October 1985, Robert Hanssen resumed his espionage activities. This time, he approached not the GRU, but the KGB, Soviet Foreign Intelligence. Once again, he initiated contact through an anonymous letter. Once again, his motivation appears to have been primarily financial. The KGB, recognizing the value of a well-placed FBI source, agreed to the arrangement. This second period of espionage would last from 1985 until Hanssen's arrest in 2001, 16 years of continuous betrayal. The KGB, and later after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, known as the SVR, assigned Hanssen the codename Ramon Garcia, an alias he had chosen himself. Within Russian intelligence files, he was also designated simply as B. The structure of Hanssen's espionage operations followed patterns designed to minimize the risk of detection. He communicated with his handlers primarily through dead drops, predetermined locations where he would leave packages containing classified materials and where his handlers would leave packages containing cash payments. This technique, standard in intelligence operations, allowed Hanssen and his handlers to exchange materials without ever meeting face-to-face, reducing the risk of surveillance detection. The locations Hanssen selected for dead drops were scattered throughout northern Virginia and suburban Maryland, typically in parks or wooded areas that offered some degree of seclusion while still being accessible. One location he used repeatedly was Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia, near his home. He would visit these locations during lunch breaks after work, or during weekends when he claimed to be running errands or going for walks. The packages he delivered contained photocopied documents, computer disks, and handwritten notes. The packages he retrieved contained cash, ultimately totaling approximately $1.4 million in cash and diamonds over 22 years, along with an additional $800, 000 deposited to a foreign bank account in Moscow that he never accessed. To signal his handlers that he had made a delivery or to confirm his readiness to receive materials, Hanssen used simple techniques involving physical markers. He would place a piece of white tape on a park signpost to indicate that a dead drop was ready for retrieval. His handlers would remove the tape after retrieving the package and would use similar signals to communicate back to him. These signals, while seemingly primitive compared to electronic communications, were remarkably difficult for counterintelligence investigators to detect because they left no electronic trace and required only seconds to execute. The information Hanssen provided to Soviet and later Russian intelligence over his years of espionage covered an extraordinary range of sensitive topics. He gave them details about U.S. technical surveillance capabilities, including information about systems used to monitor communications. He provided information about FBI and CIA double agents, people who were working for U.S. intelligence while pretending to work for Soviet or Russian intelligence. He revealed the existence of highly classified programs, including details about a secret tunnel the FBI had constructed under the Soviet embassy in Washington to intercept communications. Perhaps most damaging, he identified human sources, people who were providing information to U.S. intelligence from within Soviet and later Russian organizations. At least 3 of these sources were arrested by Soviet authorities, tried for espionage, and executed. Their names were Sergei Motorin, Valery Martinov, and Dmitry Polyakov. All 3 were KGB officers who had been recruited by the FBI or CIA and had been providing valuable intelligence about Soviet operations. Hanssen's betrayal of these men directly resulted in their deaths. Motorin was arrested in 1985 and executed in 1987. Martinov was arrested in 1985 and executed in 1987. Polyakov, who had been providing information to U.S. intelligence since the 1960s and was considered one of the most valuable Western intelligence sources within the Soviet system, was arrested in 1986 and executed in 1988. For years, U.S. intelligence officials did not know how these sources had been compromised. Multiple investigations sought to identify the leak. Suspicion fell on various individuals, including Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who was arrested in 1994 for espionage. But while Ames had indeed betrayed some sources, he had not betrayed all of them. Someone else had also been providing information to the Russians. That someone was Robert Hanssen. The personal life Hanssen maintained during these years of espionage appeared, from the outside, to be conventionally successful and devout. He and Bonnie raised their 6 children in what neighbors described as a strict but caring household. The children attended Catholic schools. The family attended Mass regularly at a local parish. Hanssen was involved in church activities and spoke frequently about his religious faith. He presented himself as a devout Catholic with strong moral convictions. The contradiction between Hanssen's professed religious devotion and his actual behavior would become a subject of extensive analysis after his arrest. How could someone who claimed to be deeply religious, who participated actively in church life, who preached about morality and ethics, simultaneously engage in espionage that endangered American lives and national security? Psychological experts who later analyzed the case suggested that Hanssen exhibited an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization, the ability to separate different aspects of his identity and behavior so completely that they did not, in his mind, conflict with each other. Adding another layer of contradiction, investigators later discovered that Hanssen had maintained a relationship with a woman in the Washington area to whom he provided money and gifts over several years. This relationship, like his espionage, represented a compartmentalized aspect of his life that contradicted his public persona as a devout family man. What Bonnie Hanssen knew about her husband's resumed espionage activities after 1985 remains unclear. She maintained that she had believed his promise in 1980 to stop his contacts with Soviet intelligence, and she claimed not to have known that he had resumed those contacts. Whether this was entirely true, or whether she chose not to see signs that might have been visible, is a question that cannot be definitively answered from available evidence. What is documented is that she was not charged with any crime related to his espionage, suggesting that prosecutors concluded she had no knowledge of or participation in his activities after 1980. The investigation that would eventually identify Hanssen required years of painstaking work involving cooperation between the FBI and CIA, as well as intelligence sharing with allied services. Throughout the 1990s, U.S. counterintelligence officials knew that someone with high-level access was providing information to Russian intelligence. Compromised operations and intercepted Russian communications indicated the existence of a source, but identifying that source proved extraordinarily difficult. The critical break came in late 2000 when the FBI received materials from a Russian intelligence source whose identity has never been publicly disclosed. These materials, obtained from Russian intelligence files, included letters that the spy had written to his handlers, audio recordings of dead drop signals, computer disks, and other operational materials. The materials did not immediately identify the spy by name, but they contained clues that could be analyzed and compared to the activities of potential suspects. Analysis of the letters revealed distinctive characteristics. The typing showed specific patterns. Certain phrases and references in the content could be correlated with knowledge that only someone with particular access would possess. When investigators compared these materials to samples from various FBI employees who had the requisite access to compromised information, the evidence began to point toward Robert Hanssen. The handwriting on certain documents, while disguised, contained features that analysts believed matched Hanssen's writing. References in the letters to specific incidents corresponded to things Hanssen would have known about. The geographic patterns of the dead drops matched areas near where Hanssen lived and worked. The accumulated evidence was not yet sufficient for prosecution, but it was sufficient to warrant intensive surveillance. In December 2000, The FBI initiated what would become the final phase of the investigation. Hanssen was placed under constant physical and electronic surveillance. His communications were monitored. His movements were documented. His computer access at work was tracked. To gain even closer access, the FBI arranged to transfer Hanssen to a newly created position at FBI headquarters that would, ostensibly, be a lateral move, but would actually place him in an office where his activities could be more easily monitored. The office was equipped with covert surveillance cameras and listening devices. Hanssen, unaware that he was under investigation, accepted the assignment. Investigators watched as he searched classified databases for information he had no operational reason to access, as he downloaded files, as he engaged in activities consistent with preparing materials for delivery to his handlers. On Sunday, February 18, 2001, at approximately 4:15 p.m., Robert Hanssen drove from his home in Vienna to Foxstone Park in Vienna, Virginia. The temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, the sky overcast with a light drizzle. Hanssen wore a dark overcoat over his business suit. In the trunk of his car, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag, was a package containing classified documents he had removed from FBI databases. Foxstone Park in winter was a quiet place. Bare trees lined the walking paths, their branches dark against the gray sky. A small stream ran through the park, its water flowing over rocks and under the wooden footbridge where Hanssen was heading. The sound of the water was the only noise besides the occasional car passing on nearby Park Street. The park was nearly empty on this cold Sunday afternoon, exactly the kind of conditions Hanssen preferred for dead drops, when the likelihood of encountering witnesses was minimal. What Hanssen did not know was that more than 20 FBI agents were already in position throughout the park. Surveillance cameras had been installed. Vehicles with agents inside were parked along nearby streets. Agents in casual clothing were positioned along the park's trails. After 22 years of espionage, after more than 6,000 days of successfully operating as a Russian intelligence asset while working as an FBI counterintelligence specialist, Robert Hanssen's double life was about to end. Hanssen parked his car and walked into the park, carrying the package. He walked to the footbridge that crossed the small stream. The bridge was constructed of wood and metal with railings on both sides. Hanssen stopped on the bridge, looked around to ensure no one was watching, reached down to the underside of the bridge's railing, and taped the package he was carrying to a support beam where it would not be visible to casual passers-by. As Hanssen turned to walk back toward his car, FBI agents moved in. An agent approached him and identified himself as FBI. Other agents surrounded the area. Hanssen was ordered to stop and place his hands where they could be seen. According to the arrest report, Hanssen's first words were, "What took you so long?" The comment suggested he had suspected at some level that his activities might eventually be discovered, though whether he had known specifically that he was under investigation at that moment remains unclear. Hanssen was arrested and taken into FBI custody. He was transported to the Washington field office where he was formally advised of his rights. He was charged with espionage, with conspiracy to commit espionage, and with attempted espionage. The charges carried potential sentences of life imprisonment or death. At the Hanssen family home in Vienna, FBI agents executed a search warrant. Bonnie Hanssen was at home with some of the children when agents arrived. According to later accounts, she was shocked and confused. She asked what her husband was accused of and insisted there must be some mistake. Agents conducted a thorough search of the property, seizing computers, documents, financial records, and other materials. The search produced significant evidence, including computer files containing classified information, materials related to dead drop locations, and financial records showing deposits that could not be explained by Hanssen's FBI salary alone. The accumulated evidence made clear that Hanssen had been engaged in espionage activities for years. The arrest of Robert Hanssen was publicly announced on February 20, 2001, 2 days after his arrest. The FBI and Department of Justice held a press conference at which they outlined the charges and described the case as one of the most serious espionage cases in American history. FBI Director Louis Freeh stated that Hanssen's betrayal had caused exceptionally grave damage to national security. The news sent shockwaves through the intelligence community and the general public. The idea that an FBI counterintelligence agent, someone whose job was to catch spies, had himself been spying for more than 20 years was almost incomprehensible. How had he evaded detection for so long? How many operations had been compromised? How many lives had been endangered or lost? For the Hanssen family, the arrest was catastrophic. The children, who ranged in age from late teens to early 30s, learned that their father was accused of espionage. Jane, the oldest, was married with her own family by this time. The younger children, still living at home or recently moved out, faced the immediate trauma of seeing their father arrested and their home searched. Bonnie Hanssen issued a statement through an attorney expressing shock and devastation. She stated that she was cooperating with investigators and that she had not known about her husband's espionage activities since his promise to stop in 1980. Whether prosecutors believed this claim or simply determined that charging her would serve no purpose, she was not indicted. The impact on the Hanssen children was immediate and lasting. Within days of Robert's arrest, reporters had identified the family and begun calling their home and approaching neighbors. The children faced difficulties at school and work. People who knew the family avoided them or, in some cases, made hostile comments. The family name had become synonymous with betrayal. The legal proceedings moved relatively quickly because Hanssen chose to plead guilty rather than contest the charges. His attorneys negotiated a plea agreement under which Hanssen would plead guilty to 15 counts of espionage and conspiracy in exchange for the government agreeing not to seek the death penalty and to provide financial support for Bonnie Hanssen from Robert's federal pension. The agreement required Hanssen to cooperate fully with damage assessment interviews and to provide truthful information about his espionage activities. On July 6, 2001, Robert Hanssen appeared in federal court in Alexandria, Virginia, and formally pleaded guilty to the charges. In his allocution, the statement a defendant makes when pleading guilty, Hanssen addressed the court directly. "I apologize for my behavior," he stated. "I am shamed by it. I have opened the door for calumny against my totally innocent wife and children. I have hurt them deeply. I have hurt so many deeply. I have hurt the United States. I had lost the compass that pointed me in the right direction." He acknowledged that he had provided classified information to Soviet and later Russian intelligence over a period of more than 20 years, that he had done so in exchange for money, and that he understood his actions had damaged national security and had resulted in the deaths of intelligence sources. Judge Claude Hilton, who presided over the case, accepted the guilty plea and set a sentencing date. On May 10, 2002, Judge Hilton sentenced Robert Hanssen to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Hilton noted the extraordinary seriousness of Hanssen's crimes, the damage caused to national security, and the lives that had been lost as a result of his betrayals. He stated that Hanssen had violated the trust placed in him by his country, his colleagues, and his family, and that the severity of the sentence reflected the severity of those violations. Hanssen was remanded immediately into custody and was subsequently transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Florence, Colorado, a maximum security facility known as ADX Florence, where he would serve his sentence in solitary confinement. The facility, sometimes called a supermax prison, was designed to hold the most dangerous or high-risk federal inmates in conditions of extreme isolation. A DX Florence houses approximately 400 inmates in single-person cells measuring 7 by 12 feet. Hanssen would spend virtually all his time in his cell, with minimal human contact and 1 hour per day allowed for solitary exercise in a small outdoor area. The FBI's damage assessment, conducted over the months following Hanssen's arrest, concluded that his espionage had compromised dozens of classified programs, had exposed more than 50 human sources, and had provided Soviet and Russian intelligence with detailed insights into American intelligence capabilities that they could use to protect their own operations and deceive U.S. intelligence. The assessment characterized the damage as among the most severe in the history of American espionage. For the families of the 3 Soviet intelligence officers whom Hanssen had betrayed, Sergei Motorin, Valery Martinov, and Dmitry Polyakov, the confirmation that an American intelligence officer had caused their arrests and executions came too late to provide any form of justice. All 3 men had been executed by Soviet authorities in the late 1980s, more than a decade before Hanssen was identified. Martinov's widow, Natalia, and his daughter lived in the United States, having been allowed to emigrate after his execution. When Natalia learned in 2001 that Robert Hanssen had been the source who had identified her husband to Soviet authorities, she expressed a mixture of anger and sorrow. In an interview in 2002, she conveyed the sentiment that while Hanssen's imprisonment provided some measure of justice, it could not undo the loss. Her husband was still dead. Her children had still grown up without their father. Hanssen's punishment did not bring Valery back or ease the decades of grief her family had endured. The Hanssen case led to a comprehensive review of security procedures within the FBI and across the intelligence community. How had Hanssen been able to operate for so long without detection? What warning signs had been missed? What systemic failures had allowed an FBI agent to spy for a foreign power for more than 2 decades? The review identified multiple points of failure. Hanssen had not been subject to regular polygraph examinations during much of his career, a security measure that might have detected his deception. His financial situation had not been closely monitored, despite regulations requiring such monitoring for employees with access to classified information. His access to classified materials had been broader than necessary for his actual job responsibilities, a violation of the need-to-know principle that should govern classified information handling. The review also revealed troubling aspects of institutional culture within the FBI. Hanssen had been known to colleagues as someone who was difficult to work with, who kept to himself, who was secretive about his activities. But these characteristics, rather than triggering concern, had simply led colleagues to avoid him. He had been, in effect, isolated within the organization in ways that gave him freedom to operate without close scrutiny. Following the review, the FBI implemented new security measures including mandatory polygraph examinations for all employees with access to sensitive information, enhanced financial disclosure requirements, stricter controls on database access, improved audit trails for computer systems, and better training on recognizing potential insider threats. For the Hanssen children, the years following their father's arrest were marked by attempts to understand and cope with what he had done. Jane Hanssen, the oldest daughter, stated in an interview years later that she had tried to understand her father's motivations but found it impossible to comprehend how he could have rationalized his actions. She described him as someone who had seemed to genuinely love his family, but who had also kept enormous secrets from them. The cognitive dissonance was, she said, something she was still trying to process. Some of the younger Hanssen children changed their last names to distance themselves from the association with espionage. They struggled with questions of identity. Were they responsible for their father's actions? Did his crimes reflect on them? How should they think about him now? These were questions without easy answers. Bonnie Hanssen maintained a lower profile, declining most interview requests. In statements released through her attorney, she expressed remorse for the damage her husband had caused and sympathy for the families of those who had suffered as a result of his actions. She stated that she had tried to move forward with her life while acknowledging the impossibility of ever fully escaping the shadow of what had happened. The financial agreement that was part of Robert Hanssen's plea deal provided her with access to a portion of his federal pension, giving her some financial stability. Robert Hanssen spent more than 22 years in solitary confinement at ADX Florence. According to reports from prison officials and attorneys who visited him, he spent his time reading, particularly religious texts, and writing letters to family members. He reportedly continued to attend Catholic Mass when permitted and to engage with his religious faith. In the few interviews he granted from prison over the years, Hanssen offered explanations for his espionage that seemed incomplete and unsatisfying. He spoke about having been motivated by money, by a desire to test his abilities against the intelligence system, by arrogance in believing he could successfully operate without detection. He expressed regret for the harm caused to the families of the men he had betrayed, though whether this regret was genuine remorse or simply an acknowledgement of consequences was difficult to determine. What Hanssen did not do, in any of his statements, was provide a clear, coherent explanation that made sense of his actions. How does a man who professes deep religious faith rationalize betraying his country and causing deaths? How does a father who claims to love his children engage in activities that he must have known could destroy their lives if discovered? Hanssen offered fragments of explanation, but never a comprehensive narrative that integrated the contradictions of his behavior. Robert Hanssen died on June 5, 2023, at the age of 79. The Bureau of Prisons announced his death without providing specific details about the cause, though officials indicated there were no suspicious circumstances. He had reportedly been in declining health for several years before his death. He was buried in a private ceremony. The Bureau of Prisons declined to specify the burial location, and the family requested privacy. His death received limited media coverage, a few brief news articles noting his passing and summarizing his crimes. The Associated Press obituary described him as one of the most damaging spies in American history and recounted the basic facts of his case. But there were no extensive retrospectives, no detailed analyses of his legacy. He had become, by the time of his death, a footnote in intelligence history, someone who had caused enormous damage, but whose story, more than 20 years after his arrest, felt like it belonged to a different era. For the Hanssen children, their father's death marked the end of a complicated relationship that had been defined by his crimes for more than 2 decades. Several of the children issued a brief statement expressing sadness at their father's passing while acknowledging the complexity of their feelings about him. They did not attend a funeral or hold any public memorial service. Bonnie Hanssen, who was 75 years old at the time of her former husband's death, did not make any public statement. Friends indicated she was aware of his death, but chose not to comment publicly. Envelopes like those postmarked from Arlington, Virginia, in early 1999 remained in FBI files as evidence. One piece among thousands in the investigation that brought down Robert Hanssen. The postmarks themselves, simple ink impressions showing dates and locations, had not exposed him. That breakthrough came from a Russian intelligence source who provided materials from Hanssen's KGB file in late 2000. But the envelopes had done something important. They had confirmed what investigators already suspected about the geography of the spy they were hunting, had helped narrow the area where he likely lived and worked, had added small pieces to a puzzle that took 22 years to complete. When investigators eventually mapped Hanssen's home and work locations against the postmark locations, they found strong correlation. The post offices were all within reasonable distance of places he regularly traveled. This type of geographic profiling, combined with analysis of other patterns in the spy's behavior, demonstrated the value of methodical, detail-oriented investigation even in an era of increasingly sophisticated electronic surveillance. The envelopes were physical artifacts, pieces of evidence that could be handled, analyzed, and preserved. In an intelligence world increasingly focused on signals intelligence and cyber operations, the Hanssen case was a reminder that traditional investigative techniques, postal tracking, physical surveillance, document analysis, remained valuable tools. The question of responsibility in cases like Robert Hanssen's is complicated because it requires assigning accountability among individuals who made choices within systems that shaped what options seemed available and what consequences seemed real or abstract. Hanssen chose to commit espionage. He made that choice repeatedly over more than 20 years, with a significant interruption when his wife discovered him in 1980. He accepted approximately $1.4 million in cash and diamonds in exchange for providing classified information. He betrayed sources whose trust in American intelligence cost them their lives. Those choices were his, and he bore primary responsibility for them. But his ability to make those choices successfully for so long was enabled by systemic failures: inadequate security procedures, insufficient oversight, a culture that did not encourage reporting of suspicious behavior, institutional barriers to information sharing between agencies. These systemic factors did not cause Hanssen's betrayal, but they created conditions in which his betrayal could continue undetected for decades. The damage extended far beyond the specific operations and sources he compromised. His espionage created a culture of suspicion within the intelligence community, damaged morale, and complicated efforts to recruit and retain talented intelligence officers. The families of the sources he betrayed suffered losses that could never be remedied. His own family experienced trauma, shame, and the destruction of their sense of security and trust. Robert Hanssen was 35 years old when he first contacted Soviet intelligence in November 1979. He was 41 when he resumed espionage in October 1985 after the 5-year hiatus. He was 57 when he was arrested at Foxstone Park with classified documents in his hands. He was 79 when he died in solitary confinement, having spent the final 22 years of his life imprisoned, exactly the same length of time he had spent as a spy. And in those final decades, he lost everything: his freedom, his family, his reputation, and whatever meaning he had once convinced himself his double life possessed. The 3 Soviet intelligence officers he betrayed, Sergei Motorin, Valery Martinov, and Dmitry Polyakov, were executed by KGB firing squads in the late 1980s, more than a decade before their betrayer was identified. Their families learned eventually who had caused their deaths, but that knowledge brought neither justice nor peace. The envelopes with their Northern Virginia postmarks are evidence, history, pieces of investigative work that contributed in small ways to solving a case. But they are also reminders that espionage is not an abstraction. Every classified document photographed, every source identified, every dead drop executed represents choices made by human beings, choices that ripple outward to destroy lives, families, and trust. And sometimes those choices leave traces as simple as postmarks on envelopes, small pieces of evidence that, when assembled with patience and thoroughness, help reveal the truth behind years of carefully maintained lies.